Now, this year marks the 80th anniversary of Parker Brothers' board game Monopoly. And as the legend has it, this board game was invented in 1930 by an unemployed salesman named Charles Darrow in his kitchen. And you're probably really familiar with this setup right here. Monopoly money, this Monopoly board game. But the actual origins of this game date back to 1903 with a game called the Landlord's Game, originally created by Elizabeth Maggie. Now, Maggie here was inspired to create what she saw as an educational game meant to criticize the Gilded Age's accumulation of wealth in the form of property ownership. She was inspired in part by the economist and social reformer Henry George, who was a fierce critic of economic inequality, and in 1879 had written a book called Progress and Poverty that argued that poverty was not simply a fact of nature, but instead the result of monopolization of land in fewer and fewer hands. His book was a national bestseller in this age of income extremes. Now, Maggie's game here, the Landlord's Game, was an underground success, and her version was later tweaked by Charles Darrow until the patent was bought out by Parker Brothers in 1935. So there's a little bit of board game history. But on this theme of monopoly, you should recognize that there's a great deal of talk today about levels of income and wealth inequality that rival and even dwarf what we saw in the Gilded Age. There was a recent article in the Washington Post that focused attention on this disparity, pointing out that Americans are no longer surprised when they hear that CEOs of major corporations make on average 300 times more than their workers, and that the top 10% of Americans take in about 28% of the country's income. Americans are kind of gotten used to this, seem to be not even really fazed by it, but the article goes on to point out that you may be surprised to learn about the disparity in wealth as opposed to income. So as this chart right here shows you, this is the disparity in income in the United States. But now we're talking about wealth. Wealth meaning not just how much you make in a year, but how much you own, how much you have in assets like stocks and bonds and land. In this case, the current fact is that the top 10% own 76% of the nation's wealth. That is a huge disparity. So you can see a chart right here where the bottom 40% literally own no wealth. The top 1% have 35% of the nation's wealth. The next 4% have 28%, and so on. This is the real heart of wealth disparity, because it's not about just the income that you're making, but the wealth that accumulates over time and gets associated with power. And the United States dwarfs all other nations in the world in terms of this enormous gap between the very wealthy and the rest. There's a short video that you should watch, and I posted it on the discussion board for you to check out, about economic inequality that makes a pretty amazing point. And essentially, it shows the gulf not only in wealth in the United States, but the disparity in what Americans think about wealth in the United States. So I'm going to give you just a few basic snapshots from the video, but you should check it out. It's about 4 minutes, 5 minutes or so. Here's the sort of essential heart of it that I want to point out to you. This is what socialism would look like, a chart of socialism, sort of pure, unadulterated socialism. That is, income distributed equally across the whole entire population. No one has any more or any less than anyone else. Pure socialism. Now, when Americans are polled about what they think the economic situation should be, very few Americans say this. Okay, socialism never really took root in the United States in the way that it did in some other countries, where people argue for complete flattening of economic standing across the board. When Americans are polled, most Americans tend to have a view that looks more like this. So this is that the distribution that 92% of Americans, when polled, choose as ideal, the ideal wealth distribution for the country. And you can see it has a sort of, it goes from poor to the wealthy. There's a huge middle class with like a steadily rising upward mobility. This is kind of very American. There's a very American tradition to this notion of economic upper mobility, social mobility, so that you can move from the bottom to the top. This is what 92 of Americans say would be the ideal. Then when polled, this is what Americans say they think it actually is. So what you're looking at is what most Americans think is the ideal. This is what most Americans think the distribution is. Okay, so there's a disparity between what they think it should be and what they think it actually is. Okay, so most Americans say it should look something like this, but it probably looks more like this. But here's the real crazy thing, is the disparity between what most Americans think the distribution is, which you're looking at right now, and what it actually is, which looks more like this. This is the actual distribution of wealth in the United States compared to what Americans think it is, compared to what Americans think it should be. So you can see that lines here where you can see the sort of the ghost of what Americans think it should be versus what they think it is to what it actually is. And this chart doesn't even really give you the full benefit of what it looks like because there's so much income at the upper end that it can't really even fit on the chart. You need to kind of break off and have a whole nother segment where you can see that the top 1% have 40% of the wealth of the United States. So this is more like what it really is. So watch that video and see what you think. I'm interested in what you think about this.
Now, last year, Pope Francis delivered a papal encyclical. That's a sort of state-of-the-world address delivered from the perspective of the Catholic Church. And in this address, the Pope focused on the dangers that he believed threaten humankind: hatred and war, environmental degradation, and the enormous gap between the rich and the poor. In surveying the global scene, he said that the world was coming to look more and more like a, quote, great pile of filth. Now this reminded me immediately of Mark Twain's description of the late 19th century in the United States as a, quote, era of incredible rottenness. The Pope was suggesting in some ways that we've entered into a new Gilded Age, an era of incredible technological advances and progress with a deep underbelly of corruption, greed, and inhumanity. Now, this particular theme of income and wealth inequality has become more and more prominent in American politics, especially now that we are in the midst of a presidential election process. Economic issues are clearly on the minds of American voters on both sides of the political spectrum. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest and the flattening of the middle class is right in the center of the Democratic Party debate between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And on the right, Donald Trump's various statements have been peppered with attacks on bankers and speculators making huge fortunes, a theme that seems to resonate with his supporters. Now, as the campaigns proceed, we should pay particular attention to the evolution of these debates and understand that this historically massive level of economic inequality is having serious effects on American society, politics, culture, and in the lives of millions of individual people. So, what do you think about all of this? You have an opportunity to do a little research and come up with some conclusions and findings in the next History of Now report, Playing Monopoly. For this one, I want you to think about the question, what is the current debate over wealth inequality and corporate power in the United States today? What do recent news and media sources tell you about current arguments over economic inequality? Do a little research into the media. You're going to find tons of stuff on this because this is a big political and social issue. Type up a 1 to 2 page report on what you find, on your findings. Include all citations anywhere you get information from, and post this report to the History of Now folder in Module 4 by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, April 15th. You'll get up to 25 points for doing that. So this is one of those requirements of the class, is to do 4 of these History of Now reports. Each one is worth 25 points. But in addition to that, after you upload that report from me, go to the History of Now discussion board on Playing Monopoly and talk about what you found to get even more points. And what I want you to do is don't go into the discussion board and just post the entire report that you wrote, the entire 2-page report. Instead, summarize it in a nice paragraph and use it to be involved in the discussion of other students about this issue of wealth inequality in the United States today.